I come to this role with an advantage of having worked on affordable housing issues for years. When I worked in city government, I worked on some of the first sort of reinventions of public housing into mixed income communities. I helped put together the affordable housing component for Atlantic Station, which was really the first time the city had used incentive programs to require affordable housing. And I have worked on, in both my private law practice and with chairing some nonprofits and working on different initiatives, really try to figure out what is it that we need and how do you get there. So what Mayor Bottoms has done to create additional sources of funding is important, but money is a tool, it's not a strategy. What we really need is a strategy for making sure that we continue to build enough housing in Atlanta, that we have housing for people at all ages and stages of life. We need to build more housing, not just affordable housing, but higher priced housing as well, because we're just not building enough housing for the people who live here, let alone all the people we expect to come here. So I would work with there's a pretty good infrastructure out there now of an alliance of nonprofit and for-profit developers and city government and private sector partners who are providing resources to build affordable housing. What the city can do is really use the Atlanta Housing Authority robustly. It has hardly been used in the last 12 years. It owns about 400 acres of land. You could probably do 20,000 very affordable units on that land. The city of Atlanta owns land that could be used for housing, that we also could activate pretty quickly. There's vacant housing around the city that could be restored, renovated, and put back in the stream of commerce. But I think what we really need is an economic development plan that focuses on where the needs are in our city. There are lots of areas that get plenty of investment, but there are lots of areas of our city that really have had no investment, public or private. And we need to use the city resources to make sure that we're spreading investment equitably around the city. I don't think there's a one-size-fits-all strategy for how you build new housing in existing neighborhoods, because our neighborhoods are very different from one another. One of the things that's interesting about Atlanta is we have a lot of different neighborhoods, lots of different types of neighborhoods. My neighborhood, Inman Park, is pretty old. My house was built in 1896. There's an apartment building across the street from me, there's a carriage house next door to me, and it all works out just fine. But newer neighborhoods, particularly in sort of, in Cascade area and in sort of the northern part of Buckhead that were developed later, really just don't have those kinds of patterns. So what I think is important is, one, make sure the areas where we already have infrastructure, transit, our transit corridors, our major thoroughfares, make sure that we're allowing for development at greater density, particularly of housing. Then with regard to building sort of smaller scale, small apartment buildings, duplexes, that we engage in conversations with all our neighborhoods about whether that might be appropriate, and if so, where. I'd be in favor of trying it in several neighborhoods where there's receptivity, maybe not in the middle of a neighborhood, but at the edges of a neighborhood, and try some of these smaller scale developments and then track it and see how it helps build out our housing supply. Because not everybody can buy a single family home, and not everybody wants to live in a 5-story apartment building. And so we need to find some context, neighborhood appropriate ways to build housing that's a little different from those two options. But the idea of just doing it across the city, I don't think is advisable. I go to church at St. Luke's Episcopal, which is literally across the street from where the Peachtree Pine shelter was, and in fact sold that building to the task force. So I've been sort of in and around the challenges of dealing with homelessness for a long time. I think we finally have, in the Partners for Home initiative that has been put together, we have a pretty good working environment of the different nonprofits and governments working together to have a more comprehensive strategy around homelessness. And rather than focusing so much on shelters, focus more of our efforts around transitional housing, because many times when people are homeless, they've got other issues. They've got drug addiction, they've got mental health issues, sometimes both. They're struggling with all kinds of challenges that you can't improve if you don't have stable, safe housing. And so getting people into transitional housing where they've got their own place, their own unit, then they can get stable and then address their health challenges, and then that makes them better able to hold a job, take care of a family, be part of our community. So we are going to have more funding for that. We're not doing it fast enough. And so that's something we'll have to look at early and thoroughly, is to find additional sources of funding to create that transitional housing, so that ultimately shelters are short term for acute problems, but help people get into housing and stabilize their lives. What matters to us is what's happening in Atlanta. And while overall crime isn't necessarily up, what is up is violent crime. As you said, violent crime, particularly homicides. It's more brazen, it's more random, it is violent. It's just different than what we've seen before. And it's caused people to be fearful. And I recognize that we have got to get a handle on that before it becomes the new normal, as they say, because that is not an acceptable way for us to live. I have tried to take a thoughtful, comprehensive approach to how you deal with public safety, because that's got to be our first priority, is making a safer city. I have brought in Dr. Cedric Alexander, who some may remember was the public safety director in DeKalb County some years ago, and then went to Rochester and was in Homeland Security, and he's now a national expert on how you can have safer cities but also do smart policing. He's been involved in sort of 21st century policing, because we can't do the things we've done before. One, the nature of what we're dealing with is different, but two, we're in a moment of racial reckoning and social justice, and we can't go back to the policing strategies that might have been used in various cities in the past. So at the same time we get a handle on what's happening today, we've also got to build a 21st century policing department and policing techniques. So I have sort of four basic things. One is we've got to support our police. We've got to be clear about what we want them to do, not ask them to do things that mental health professionals or social service agencies ought to do, and then recruit the right people, give them the right training, give them the right equipment, give them the right support to perform those roles, and hold them accountable performing those roles. And training is a critical part of this. De-escalation, learning how to handle a crisis where somebody may be having a mental health crisis. Those are critical to that sort of modern way to police. Number two, we've got to have a better relationship and work more closely with the county and the state and federal partners to make sure that violent criminals stay in jail. That's gotten more complicated because of the courts being closed due to the pandemic. But we've got to get a handle on that, because that is part of our problem right now. Number three, we all know that there are problem properties. There are places where people gather where they shouldn't. There are places that are operating in violation of their alcohol licenses, or maybe don't even have an alcohol license. We've got the laws on the books to deal with those. We just need to have a clear strategy and political will to take care of those. I think you could probably take my first 100 days, I'd try to take those 100 most problematic properties and either shut them down or bring them into compliance. The fourth thing is community policing. A lot of people use that term. It doesn't need to just be a little division or a little department in public safety. It needs to be the way we operate. The police need to re-engage with the community. The community needs to feel like they can trust the police, and the police need to be able to trust the community. And that really involves getting officers back in the community, being back in the neighborhoods. You know the owner of the corner store, you know the pastor down the street, you know the school principal, you know the kids, and you know how they're doing, you know who's doing well, you know who might need some help. Because ultimately, you can't police your way out of crime. You have to do things that reduce the likelihood that people will be drawn to crime. You know, criminals are not born. Nobody raises their hand in 5th grade and says, I'd like to be a carjacker. It happens when people don't have enough other choices. And so my goal ultimately is really to focus on healthy neighborhoods. That's really what I was most concerned about and what I wanted to focus on before we had the crime wave. But it all comes back to the same thing, which is we really need to support our most distressed neighborhoods and work with the community leaders, work within the neighborhoods, help them get the things that they need so that the children who grow up in those neighborhoods can get to age 18 with a good education, opportunity, they're healthy, and can lead a healthy, successful life. We've asked the schools to do everything. You know, we've asked the schools to fix the neighborhoods, fix the kids. Schools are part of it, but if the neighborhoods are healthier, the schools are going to be healthier. There are some effort, we've got a lot of great Boys and Girls Clubs, and there are various nonprofits out there who do a great job helping young people. But then the At Promise centers have been put together to help kids who maybe been in some trouble and try to turn that around so that they have a different path to a productive life. Probably need to do more of those types of programs and tie it more to not just catching you up with your education so you can get a GED, but really focus on job training, vocational training, and then job placement. All the job training in the world doesn't do you any good if you can't actually get a job. And to me, one of the exciting opportunities of the infrastructure plan, because President Biden's infrastructure plan is going to pass at some point, and we could get enormous resources here in the city. And that is a great opportunity, in my view, to be very intentional about giving Atlantans opportunities for good paying jobs, because construction jobs, infrastructure jobs, those are very good paying jobs. And they help you develop skills that you can support your family for a lifetime. And so it seems to me that we have a great opportunity to particularly focus on young people and tying them together to opportunities as part of that infrastructure plan. Well, that sort of goes back to the conversation we just had. We've got a great opportunity to take advantage of the infrastructure programs and, of course, all the transit and transportation projects that Atlanta is working on to really do an intentional way, tying together the programs that APS does with the programs at our technical colleges, because we've got some great technical college programs. I would use sort of the business organizations, really draw in the private sector and use business organizations to connect them together. That's the kind of thing I've always done, is find out all the different parts of a puzzle and convene them and develop a strategy around making sure that they're not just working in isolation, but they're working together to really move the needle. It's not one or two things, it's probably 10 or more. But I think that is something we've got resources in Atlanta to do. It's just not always done in a coordinated fashion.